Welcome to a study of the book of Revelation. We're going to start with an introduction, some things that we need to know before we actually open the pages to the book itself. Because there are many things that perhaps some don't know about what was going on in the day and time that the book was written. We also need to know how the book was written, to whom it was written, and why it was written. And so we're going to look at some things that lead up to that point that the book was written. The first thing we need to look at are principles of interpretation. In other words, some things that can help us to know what the book is all about. This comes from Frank Pack's commentary, 2-volume set on the book of Revelation. Number one, the Bible is the best and basic interpreter of itself. All guidance that the book of Revelation gives to its own meaning should be followed. Its interpretation of symbols should be carefully attended. So in other words, let the Bible speak for itself. Number two, the larger context should always interpret the immediate context, since the Bible possesses unity. Out of this larger context, the immediate context of any passage can be taken carefully into consideration. To attempt to understand one isolated unit apart from the whole is to misinterpret the book. So in other words, we need to keep it in its context, and we shouldn't miss the forest for the trees. The historical background, purpose, style of writing, and other background matters should be taken into consideration. So that's what we're going to do as well. We're going to look at the historical background. We're going to look at the purpose of the book, why it was written, the style of writing with which John wrote the book. Number four, the New Covenant should be allowed to interpret the Old Covenant. Revelation used Old Testament terminology with New Testament meanings. In fact, the New Testament, the New Covenant, is the Old Covenant fulfilled. You know, Jesus said in Matthew 5:17, he didn't come to destroy the law of the prophets, he came to fulfill. Number five, the prophetic nature of Revelation should be noted. As a prophet, John was more concerned with spiritual principles than detailed prediction. So he wanted his audience to know the message that he was trying to convey rather than every little minute detail. Because this is a book of visions and pictures, presented in a dramatic fashion, it should be understood to have a symbolic meaning. Full attention must be given to the pictorial and dramatic in this book. In other words, the book was written symbolically. It says that it was. And when we get into the text itself, and as we get into how the book was written, we'll see where Revelation says that it was written symbolically. Number seven, one should get the total meaning of the visions or series of visions without pressing details. So in other words, we need to get the overall meaning of the entire book or an entire passage. And that's much more important than every little detail in every little verse. Number eight, do not make the difficult passages in the book the key to the meaning of the entire book. Keep searching for the answers to the proper meaning of these passages. So in other words, there will be some passages that are more difficult than others. And we need to focus in on those. We don't need to focus in on those and miss the greater picture. Number nine, while this book was primarily addressed to first-century Christians, it contains a specific blessing to everyone who reads it and to everyone who hears its message. Chapter 1 and verse 3 says that. It addresses the entire Christian age and covers it, but not in continuous succession. The principle of recapitulation holds that the book looks at the same period and the same events under different aspects in different parts. For instance, the final judgment seems to be referred to in a variety of passages. And so while we're looking at the context of first century Christians, principles can be applied throughout history. And number 10, the principle of prolepsis or anticipation shows itself in this book. Prolepsis is defined by Milligan as the tendency of the writer to anticipate in earlier sections by mere allusion what he is only to explain at a later part of his revelation. For instance, the second death is in chapter 2, verse 11, and it's not explained until chapter 20, verse 14. This is another way of saying that the book itself is one of the best interpreters of its ideas. So in other words, what Revelation does sometimes is it may lay out for you this picture, and it may or may not interpret it as it's laying it out. And if it doesn't, sometimes it explains it later. Sometimes it explains it in the immediate context. And so that's another way of saying just let the book interpret itself. So sometimes we may try to assign a meaning to a certain passage when later in the book itself it gives us the meaning of the passage. So these are just some principles of interpretation that we need to look at, that we need to understand before actually getting into the book. And we'll continue in the second lesson in regards to some more background and introductory material.